And within another 3 years after I left, the college announced closure. Being successful does not mean that you're competent. It doesn't mean you're incompetent either. I've been president of 2 different universities or colleges, one a college, the other a university. And I'm going to tell you the story of how I ended up becoming the president of a college and where that led me and where it led me astray as well. So a number of years ago, I guess it was 8 or 9 years ago at this point, I was on a sabbatical. As a professor, every 7 years, you get time to do some dedicated research and you step away from your day-to-day work and you can travel somewhere. I ended up going to the East Coast to an elite private higher education institution that gave me a fellowship, and I was working out there, working on what was at the time, I believe, my 6th book that I was publishing, a book on self-directed learning. I was interviewing a bunch of people related to the book and related to some other research projects, and my family went on all sorts of adventures on the East Coast and the like. And I ended up being contacted out of the blue by a search agency that asked if I would be willing to let my name stand or for me to be at least open to an interview for the possibility of serving as president of a small experimental college at the time located in central Vermont. And I knew about the college because of my research. I had a research background in innovation and entrepreneurship and education, and I knew this institution. It was a very creative, fascinating institution. They never used letter grades. They had a ton of incredible artists and playwrights and musicians who graduated from there over the years. So it had an inspiring reputation. And I had pretty much read everything ever written about this institution, just on one of my rabbit holes that I went down in my reading and research over the years. And I decided to go through the interview process, even though I never aspired to be a president of a college, never wanted to be. So I went through the interview process. A number of fascinating things happened. In fact, I remember being invited to the campus, and during the interview process, I was sitting in this building in the middle of campus called the Clock House. And the night before, there had been a terrible storm, and they were doing a lot of cleanup around the campus. And the first question they asked me was, "Tell me about your leadership style." And I said, "Well, I think that hubris is the downfall of many great leaders." And at the very moment that I said that, a massive tree fell. You could hear it cracking, and it fell, and it hit the ground and made a big thump. And everyone's eyes opened widely, as did mine. My jaw dropped, and people felt there was some kind of supernatural message being made there, either that I'm definitely not the person or I am the person or something. And I don't equate that tree falling to anything of that sort. It certainly happened at an opportune moment, though. And it did end up resulting in them deciding not to actually offer me the job. And then a couple of months went by, and I had finished my sabbatical, and I was back at my home higher ed institution working, loving what I did, wanting to continue doing that the rest of my life. And I ended up getting a call, and they asked if I would be open to the position. And I said I would. And they said, "Well, we're going to have to share some information with you, though, and then you can decide if you want to actually take this job." And I don't know why I wanted the position at the time. And I think part of it was because the institution was going through a very difficult time. And I liked the idea of being part of saving a truly inspiring, distinct higher ed institution, one that didn't use letter grades, one that gave narrative feedback. Students did a major project every semester, very fascinating model, had what some might call a European model of education, although those at this institution would not be proud of that comparison or correlation. The information they shared with me was that this institution was in serious trouble. In fact, it had received a notification from its regional accreditors that it was likely to lose its accreditation. And for a higher education institution, losing your regional accreditation is pretty much a death sentence. Students are ineligible for federal financial aid. The credits that students get are at risk of not transferring to other institutions or being considered valuable for various uses. And so it was in a tough circumstance. And so I asked for more information, and I got to look at the financials of the institution. I got to learn a little bit more about it. And oddly enough, the more I learned, the more this felt like a quest that I wanted to go on. And I also, along the way, had, as a person of faith, I'd been praying a lot about learning to love people who are very different from myself, people that I might disagree with on many matters, while holding firm to my own convictions. So how do you do that? You love people that are really different, and you stay faithful to your own convictions. So it's not compromising, but you're still caring. And I'd been really thinking about that in my own personal life. And this institution had a community that I think that fit very well. I came from a very different kind of belief system and background than many at this institution. And so I was drawn to that as well. And I went, and my whole family went, and I lived in I don't know, it must have been a 500 square foot, 1-bedroom cottage. We turned the living room into a second bedroom for the rest of my family. Very small galley kitchen. I had tons of mice in it, and I lived there, and I lived maybe 100 feet away from my office. And I came in, and I listened, and I listened, and I listened, and I learned. And we had to make a lot of really quick changes, because not only was the institution in trouble with the accreditors, it was in trouble with the accreditors because its enrollment had plummeted from its peak of 800 or 900 students down to a couple of hundred students, I believe. It had had no successful fundraising years in its recent history, and private institutions really depend upon fundraising. It really didn't even have a functional fundraising office. It had a couple of people that were trying to do good work and were really gifted, but they didn't have the resources to necessarily do their best work. And a lot of the supporters were very skeptical about giving any money to this institution because of its history of troubles. So it was struggling. I learned that, for example, the form on the website where you collect leads for new students had been broken for months, and they were actually getting that when someone would inquire to go to the institution, they weren't actually getting that information reliably. So you can understand why enrollment was potentially a problem. So there were financial problems, there were enrollment problems, there were tensions between the staff and the faculty and administration historically. Off and on, there were tensions internally in different ways. There were a lot of things going on. And so I walked into that with my eyes wide open, aware that there was a slim chance that this institution would make it more than 3 months. So I was coming in with the idea that we had 3 months at best, and we were in such a deficit financially that I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it was a very large amount compared to its annual budget. We had to do some work very quickly. So we rebuilt the fundraising office and unit. We rebuilt marketing. We rebuilt admission. We rebuilt the business office. We started revising a lot of different things. We negotiated a new contract with the faculty union over those 3 years. I signed a 3-year contract, and my goal was to see what I could do in 3 years. And I wasn't really committed to being a college president beyond 3 years, but I wanted to see what we could do. And honestly, it was a matter of days, weeks, or months to turn this institution around if we were going to be successful. And really at the best, after hitting a few key targets in the first months, then we'd have maybe a year or two to make some really significant changes. And I had interviewed a lot of the leaders of other institutions that closed and succeeded. And so I knew that the chances were not great, but I felt like the mission was worth the risk. So we did all of this work, and I felt like I was being a somewhat effective leader. I knew I wasn't the most skilled leader in many regards. I had to learn a lot. I had to learn about how financial aid works and business offices work and everything. Every single office and unit at the college I had got involved in to some extent, trying to understand. I'd never served at an organization with unions, and so learning about how union contracts work. I had to learn about the beliefs and values of the culture and the individuals that were really different from where I was coming from. And there was a lot of work, and I put in 20-hour days for a lot of those 3 years, strategizing, fundraising, rebuilding offices and units, writing up models and drafts of proposals and ideas, keeping the board informed, coordinating with the board. We rebuilt the board with new expertise that was related. So it was a lot of work. And I was really proud to say that at the end of my time, while I left a little sooner than I think some would have preferred, and after my 3-year contract was up, I ended up getting an offer to be president of another institution. And I was hesitant to do that as well because I never aspired to be a president. But I felt really good about the work that we as a team had done together. We turned this place around in many regards. When I left, we had a surplus, the largest surplus that we would have had in years financially. Our enrollment had grown multiple semesters in a row. We were having a good, solid, consistent, steady fundraising every year. All of those offices had been rebuilt. We were really on track to doing some good things, so I thought. And then a new president came in who was very competent from the things in my conversations with that person and looking at things on paper. I felt like college was in very good hands with him and the board. And I left, and things did not continue to go in the direction that I thought they would. And within another 3 years after I left, the college announced closure. So I can remember the day that I learned the college was closing. It wasn't anyone from that college that had notified me because I'd been gone from there for 2.5, 3 years by that time. But a friend of mine who's a futurist and a person who studies higher education had sent me an email and saying, "So sorry to hear about this. I know you put a lot of effort into this." And it hit me. It hit me hard. And honestly, this experience is part of what got me back involved in studying cognitive biases and logical fallacies. Because I really felt like I had done good work and that the team had done good work and that we had compromised and we had worked and sacrificed and made good calculated risks together. And I felt like we had done all the things necessary to set that college up for success. And I do not believe that my predecessor was the cause of it just turning around, going in a different direction. I knew that was a very capable person from my conversations and even on paper. I knew that there had to be some other factors, and to this day, I still don't know all the factors that contributed to its closing. I was not privy to any information after I left. But I will say this, after I left, for those 3 years before the college closed, there were a number of people who really respected the work that I did and indicated that to me. And they believed that it was an indication, that my leadership there was an indication of my competence as a leader to help turn around institutions that were in places of difficulty. Survivorship bias is this idea that if you survive something, you somehow attribute some kind of personal virtue or trait to your survival, but your survival could have actually been just a matter of chance. It might not have actually related to your competence in any way. It could have, and it might not have. But making the assumption that it's speaking to your competence, that's where the survivorship bias comes into play. And the other one is outcome bias. Outcome bias is a similar kind of idea where you have some really favorable outcome and you attribute that outcome to something that you did. So for example, this happens even in superstitious ways. Maybe you find a 4-leaf clover and then you buy a lottery ticket and you win the lottery. And somehow you attribute your picking up that 4-leaf clover to winning the lottery. Or maybe you have these thoughts of these specific numbers and you choose the numbers and they end up being the winning numbers. And now you believe that somehow you have some kind of special trait. But if you tried to repeat that, I'm pretty sure the outcome would not work out the way that you want. It's a bias that's at work in our minds. So outcome bias and survivorship bias, they are distinct, but they can be related, where basically they both lead to an inflated view of our competence for new and novel circumstances. And while I did learn a lot there, and I did put a lot of time and effort in there, and I did try to use my best thinking, I think it would be a cognitive bias to somehow think that because all of those positive things happened during my leadership, that it was my leadership that somehow resulted in all of those things. Some of the things could have been a matter of chance and circumstance. There are other factors beyond our control that help contribute to financial resources. It could have been the timing for a particular donor choosing to re-engage or commit. And I'm not trying to dismiss this, and it's absolutely not a humble brag. This was a real gut check and a real eye-opener for me, because I realized as I started reading more about cognitive biases that I had succumbed to survivorship bias and to outcome bias. That the outcome of that institution when I left, I attributed to evidence that I had some kind of specialized skill or ability in helping an institution. It would be an equal cognitive error for me to say that I lacked any skill or ability. But there's a great thinker in this area, Annie Duke, who was a poker champion and wrote a book called Making the Bets, where she said that many people think leadership is akin to the game of chess, and if you play all of your moves correctly, you will almost consistently win. You will statistically win much more often. But in fact, leadership is more akin to a game of poker, and you can be dealt a particular hand, and you play your hand to the absolute best of your ability. And even if you do, you can lose. And you can be given a hand, and you can play it poorly, and you can actually win. Or you could be given a hand where you're almost certain to win if you play it even moderately well. And you could play it moderately well and win, but that doesn't speak to your brilliance as a poker player. Almost anyone could have won with that particular hand. You get the idea. The point was that many people look at the outcome to determine whether or not one is engaging in the decision-making and the thinking skills and the habits that lead to excellence and lead to consistently great results, when in fact the outcome is not always the best thing to look at. Sometimes really brilliant people do their very best, and the outcome does not point to that. And sometimes people that are not so brilliant or competent happen to have a number of good things come together, and the outcome looks good. And what this leads to is, this is not about beating oneself up, but it is a point of what I've talked about before, epistemological humility, about being humble about what we do or don't know, and about being slow to make assumptions about what caused what, and about being willing to listen and learn and continually pay attention to how we're thinking, and using our clearest and best thinking to make the absolute wisest and best decisions for that moment, given the circumstances, given the resources. We commend those efforts and we see how they play out. And sometimes the results are going to be great, and sometimes they're not going to be great. If you're engaging in really good, solid, clear thinking and using wisdom, we hope that in many circumstances that's going to increase your chance of success, and it usually will. But it doesn't guarantee them, in the same way that your past successes do not guarantee future successes. And that's the point of this video.